The snow came down hard that night, and Lyra Bennett had not eaten since morning. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the food hall, watching through a cracked window as the higher-ranked wolves of the Blackthorn pack tore into roasted meat, warm bread, and bowls of stew that steamed in the freezing air. Her stomach twisted so tightly she had to press a hand against it to keep from crying out. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in the pack, and Omegas ate last, if they ate at all. Inside, laughter rang out. Vanessa Voss, daughter of the Alpha, threw her head back and cackled at something one of the guards said, her plate still half full of food she would not finish. Lyra watched that plate, the way a starving man watches a fire he cannot touch. She knew better than to knock on that door and ask for scraps. Last time she had tried, Vanessa had thrown a cup of water at her and called her a stray dog that did not know when to leave. Lyra turned from the window and walked toward the small shed at the edge of the packlands, the place she had called home since her parents died 3 winters ago. There was no fire inside, only a thin blanket and a few pieces of old wood she had gathered herself. She sat down, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and reached into the pocket of her worn coat. Her fingers found a single piece of bread, hard and small, the last food she owned in the world. She stared at it for a long moment. Tomorrow she would find more, she told herself. She always found a way. She always had before. A sound outside made her freeze. It was not the wind. It was something heavier, something that moved with effort, like a body dragging itself through snow. Lyra's ears, sharp even for an Omega, picked up a low groan of pain. She should have stayed inside. Every instinct told her that whatever was out there in this pack of wolves who did not care for her could easily be dangerous. But there was something else in that sound too, something raw and desperate that pulled at her chest before her mind could argue against it. She opened the door of the shed and stepped into the biting cold. The moon gave just enough light to see a shape slumped against the trunk of a bare oak tree, a short distance away. Lyra moved closer, her bare feet sinking into the snow, and saw a man collapse there, his clothes torn, his face bruised, blood crusted along his temple. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. He looked like he had walked for days without rest, without food, without anyone caring whether he lived or died. Lyra had seen wolves like this before. Rogues, wolves without a pack, cast out or fleeing something worse, wandering the borders between territories with nothing and no one. The Blackthorn pack had strict rules about rogues. They were to be reported, sometimes chased off, sometimes worse. Lyra knew she should turn around and pretend she had seen nothing. Instead, she knelt down in the snow beside him. "Can you hear me?" she asked softly. The man's eyes opened, just barely, dark and glassy with exhaustion. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. Up close, despite the dirt and the bruises, there was something striking about his face, a sharpness in his jaw, a quiet strength even in his weakened state, as though whatever had broken him had not truly touched what lived underneath. She looked around, but there was nothing nearby to help, no fire, no shelter close enough to drag him to safely. She unwrapped the thin blanket from her own shoulders and laid it over him instead, tucking it around his arms, even though the cold immediately bit into her own skin. "Why?" the man managed to whisper, his voice hoarse and broken. "Why help me?" Lyra paused at the question, as if she had never considered that helping someone needed a reason. "Because you're hurt," she said simply, "and it's cold. That's enough of a why, isn't it?" The man studied her for a long moment, his eyes tracing her thin frame, the frost already forming at the edges of her hair, the way her lips had gone pale from the cold she had just given away to a stranger. He said nothing more, only watched her with an intensity that made her look away first. Lyra reached into her pocket and pulled out the last piece of bread she owned. She had been saving it, rationing it in her mind for the walk to the river tomorrow, where she sometimes found berries even in winter, or roots she could boil into something like a soup. It was not much. It was everything she had. She held it out to him without a second thought. "Here," she said. "You need this more than I do." The man's eyes moved from her face to the bread and back again, something flickering behind his gaze that looked almost like disbelief. "You don't know me," he said. "I could be dangerous. I could be a threat to your pack." "You're a person who is starving in the snow," Lyra answered. "That's all I need to know tonight." She placed the bread gently into his hand and closed his fingers around it, when he did not move to take it himself. Then she stood, brushing the snow from her knees, and took a step back toward her shed, arms wrapped around herself against the cold that now had nothing to keep it out. "Wait," the man called after her, his voice a little stronger now, though still rough. "What is your name?" She turned back, hesitating only a moment. There was no harm in a name, she thought. Names cost nothing. "Lyra," she said. "Lyra," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth, as though he wanted to remember it. "Thank you, Lyra." She only nodded, too cold to form more words, and disappeared back toward her shed, leaving him alone beneath the bare oak tree, with a piece of bread in his hand, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the blanket she had given him. Inside her shed, Lyra curled into the corner where the wind could not reach as easily, her arms wrapped tight around her knees, her stomach aching with a hunger she had grown almost used to. She did not regret giving away her food. She told herself this over and over as she shivered through the night, waiting for sleep that came slow and uneven. She did not know, could not have known, that the man she had just fed with her last bite of bread was not a rogue at all. His name was Kalen Ashford, and he was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, ruler of lands so vast that most in the Blackthorn Pack had never even seen its borders. He commanded armies of wolves, held the loyalty of a dozen lesser packs, and carried a name that made lesser alphas bow their heads when they spoke it. He had come to these lands in secret, stripped of his title and his fine clothes, wounded from an ambush meant to kill him, traveling disguised and unrecognized while he searched for the truth behind a growing corruption spreading through the packs that answered to him. He had been left for dead only hours before Lyra found him, betrayed by men he had trusted, his guards scattered or worse, his body battered from the fight that had nearly ended his life. He had crawled through the snow with nothing left, no food, no fire, no one who knew his name, or cared whether he lived to see morning. And then a girl with nothing to her own name had knelt beside him in the freezing dark and given him the last thing she owned without a single question about who he was or what he could offer her in return. Kalen sat beneath the oak tree long after she had gone, the blanket still wrapped around his shoulders, the piece of bread held carefully in his hand, as though it might disappear if he moved too quickly. He had eaten in grand halls with tables stretched wider than most homes, surrounded by wolves who called him powerful, who called him great, who called him king. None of them had ever looked at him the way this girl had, as though his suffering mattered simply because he was suffering, without any thought of what his gratitude might be worth. He broke off a small piece of the bread and ate it slowly, savoring it in a way he had never savored a feast in his own halls. It was hard and a little stale, nothing special by any measure, and yet it was the most meaningful meal he had eaten in years. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called out over the frozen trees, and Kalen Ashford, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, found himself staring in the direction of a small shed at the edge of the Blackthorn lands, wondering about the girl named Lyra, who had given away everything she had, without expecting anything at all. He did not know yet what this meant. He only knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that he could not simply walk away from this place in the morning, as though nothing had happened. The wind picked up again, sharp and cold, but for the first time in hours, Kalen Ashford did not feel quite so alone in it. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of pale winter light that gave little warmth even as it broke through the clouds. Lyra woke stiff and cold, her stomach hollow with hunger, and for a moment, she almost believed the night before had been a dream, some strange trick of exhaustion and cold conjuring a wounded stranger beneath a tree. But when she stepped outside, the snow near the oak tree still bore the shape of where he had lain, and the blanket she had given him was gone, along with the man himself. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space, an odd feeling settling in her chest that she could not quite name. She told herself it did not matter. She had done what was right, and now the stranger was gone, likely moving on to wherever rogues moved on to, and her life would continue exactly as it always had. She did not know that less than a mile away, hidden behind the tree line, Kalen Ashford was watching her from a distance, healing wounds that would take days to fully close, and making a quiet decision that would change both of their lives forever. He was not leaving, not yet. Not until he understood the kind of person who could give away her very last bite of food to a stranger who had nothing to offer her but a name. 3 days passed before Lyra saw the stranger again, and in that time, she had almost convinced herself he had been nothing more than a fever dream, brought on by hunger and cold. She had gone about her routine as she always did, waking before dawn to gather firewood, checking the traps she had set near the river for anything small enough to eat, avoiding the eyes of the higher-ranked wolves who saw her as little more than furniture that happened to move. On the 4th morning, as she knelt by the frozen edge of the river, trying to break through the ice with a sharp stone, she heard footsteps behind her, careful and quiet, the kind of steps someone takes when they do not want to startle another person. She turned quickly, stone still in hand, ready to defend herself if needed. But it was him, the stranger from the oak tree, though he looked different now, cleaner, though still thin, still bearing the fading marks of bruises along his jaw. He had found simple clothes from somewhere, a plain gray coat that fit him loosely, and his dark hair had been pushed back from his face. He looked less like a man who had nearly died in the snow, and more like someone who had simply had a hard season. "You're alive," Lyra said, and then immediately felt foolish for how obvious the words were. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Thanks to you," he said. "I don't think I would have made it through that night without your help." Lyra shrugged, standing and brushing snow from her knees. Anyone would have done the same. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not anyone. Most people would have walked past, many did, that night, before you found me. You were the only one who stopped." She did not know how to respond to that, so instead she busied herself with the stone in her hand, chipping at the stubborn ice covering the water. He watched her for a moment, before kneeling down beside her, careful of his still healing ribs, and began helping her break the ice with his bare hands. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I want to," he replied. "It's the least I can do for the woman who gave a stranger her last piece of bread." They worked in silence for a while, the only sound the crack of ice and the soft rush of water beneath it. When they finally broke through, Lyra dipped a small clay jug into the cold water and set it aside to carry back to her shed. "What's your name?" she asked finally, realizing she had never learned it that first night. He hesitated only a moment, and later he would remember this exact instant as the first time he had chosen to hide something from her. "Cole," he said. It was not entirely a lie. It had been a name he used once, long ago, before crowns and titles had complicated his life. Just Cole. "Well, Cole," Lyra said, testing the name. "You look like you could use a proper meal, if I can manage to catch anything today." "I don't want to take more from you," Cole said. "You've already given me more than you should have." "You're still healing," Lyra pointed out, nodding toward the fading bruise along his temple. "A healing body needs food. Besides, I'm rather good at finding things others overlook." There was something in the way she said it, light and almost playful despite the harshness of her circumstances, that made Cole's chest tighten in a way he did not fully understand. He had spent his life surrounded by wolves who calculated every word for advantage, who smiled with careful intention, who gave nothing without expecting something greater in return. This girl offered kindness the way breathing came naturally, without thought of cost or benefit. They spent the better part of the morning together, Lyra showing him where certain roots grew hidden beneath the snow, roots that could be boiled down into something warm and filling even in the dead of winter. Cole, despite claiming to be a simple wandering rogue, proved surprisingly skilled with his hands once his strength began returning, helping her set snares along paths she had not thought to check before. "You're good at this," Lyra observed, as he tied off a snare with practiced, efficient movements. "I learned survival skills a long time ago," Cole said, which was true enough, though he did not mention that those skills had been taught to him by the finest trackers in his own territory, meant to prepare him for leading armies rather than avoiding starvation. As the sun rose higher, casting a pale gold light across the snow-covered ground, Lyra found herself talking more freely than she had in years. She told him about her parents, both gone now, victims of a harsh sickness that swept through the pack 2 winters back, taking the weak and the poorly fed first, as sicknesses in the Blackthorn pack always seemed to do. She told him how she had been an Omega even before her parents died, how her family had never held status or favor within the pack, and how that lack of standing had passed down to her like an inheritance she never asked for and could never escape. Cole listened to all of it with a stillness that surprised her, his eyes never leaving her face, his questions gentle and genuine rather than pitying. He did not offer sympathy she did not want, nor did he try to fix problems that could not be fixed with words alone. He simply listened, and in the listening, Lyra felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Seen. "Doesn't it make you angry?" Cole asked eventually, his voice carefully measured. "The way they treat you. The way this whole pack seems to have decided your worth, before you ever had a chance to prove otherwise." Lyra considered the question seriously before answering. "Sometimes," she admitted, "late at night, when I'm cold and hungry, and I can hear them laughing over full plates of food. Yes, it makes me angry, but anger doesn't fill my stomach, and it doesn't keep me warm. So I try not to hold on to it for too long. It's not worth the energy I don't have to spare." Something shifted in Cole's expression then, something that looked almost like anger on her behalf, quickly hidden behind a carefully composed calm. He said nothing of it, but the observation settled deep inside him, another piece of information he tucked away alongside everything else he was learning about this remarkable woman and the pack that had failed to see her worth. As afternoon approached, Lyra gathered what they had found: roots and a small rabbit caught in one of the snares, enough for a modest but real meal. She built a small fire near her shed, careful to keep the smoke low so as not to draw unwanted attention from patrols, and prepared the food with quiet efficiency, born from years of practice. Cole watched her work, marveling at how she managed to create something warm and nourishing from so little, how she moved through her hardship, not with despair, but with a kind of quiet determination that refused to be broken by circumstances that would have crushed most people. He thought of the great feasts held in his own halls, tables groaning under the weight of food that would go half-eaten and discarded, and felt a sharp pang of something close to shame. When the food was ready, Lyra split it evenly between them without hesitation, offering him the larger portion of the rabbit meat despite having done most of the hunting and preparation herself. "You should take more," Cole protested. "You caught this. You should have the bigger share." "You need to heal," Lyra said simply, as though this settled the matter entirely. "I'll be fine with what I have." Cole studied her for a long moment, this woman who had already given away her last piece of bread to a stranger, who now offered the larger portion of a hard-earned meal, without a second thought, who seemed constitutionally incapable of putting her own needs above someone else's suffering. "You give too much away," he said quietly. "One day you'll have nothing left for yourself." Lyra smiled, though there was something tired behind it, something that spoke of years of exactly this kind of sacrifice. "Maybe," she said. "But what kind of person would I be if I let someone else go hungry while I had food to spare? I'd rather have less and know I did right by someone than have more and wonder what kind of person that made me." Cole did not respond right away. He simply ate in silence, turning her words over in his mind, comparing them against every lesson he had ever learned about leadership, about strength, about what it truly meant to rule wisely over others. He had studied politics and strategy his entire life, had been trained by the sharpest minds in his territory to understand power and how to wield it. And yet here, in a freezing shed at the edge of a pack that did not value her, sat a woman who understood something about goodness that all his teachers had somehow failed to convey. Before he left that evening, Cole paused at the entrance to her shed, the fading light casting long shadows across the snow. "Thank you, Lyra," he said, and there was a weight to his words that she did not fully understand, a gratitude that seemed to reach beyond a simple shared meal. "You already thanked me," she said, with a small laugh. "You don't have to keep doing that." "I think I do," Cole replied, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. "I don't think you understand yet how rare you are." He left before she could ask what he meant, disappearing into the tree line with the careful, quiet steps of someone accustomed to moving unseen. Lyra watched him go, a strange warmth lingering in her chest despite the falling temperature of the evening, and told herself firmly that it meant nothing, that a rogue passing through her life for a few days changed nothing about her circumstances. She did not know that miles away, hidden in a small cave that served as his temporary shelter, Kalen Ashford was sending a coded message through a trusted hawk to his most loyal advisor, informing him that he was alive, that his investigation into the corruption spreading through allied packs would continue, and that he required more time in the Blackthorn territory before returning to claim his throne. He did not mention Lyra in that message. He was not yet ready to explain, even to himself, why the thought of leaving her behind felt like leaving something vital unfinished. Winter tightened its grip on the Blackthorn lands over the following weeks, and with it came a rhythm neither Lyra nor Cole spoke of directly, but both understood without words. Nearly every day, he found her somewhere along the edges of the pack territory, at the river, near the tree line, sometimes waiting outside her shed just after dawn. And nearly every day, she welcomed him without question, sharing whatever small amount of food she had managed to gather, teaching him the quiet skills of survival that had kept her alive through years of neglect. Cole told himself he stayed to protect her, to understand the corruption he suspected ran through packs like this one, to gather information that would matter once he returned to his throne. But some nights, lying awake in the cold cave that sheltered him, he admitted a harder truth to himself. He stayed because being near Lyra had become the only part of his day that felt honest. One particular morning, gray clouds hung low and heavy, promising more snow before nightfall. Lyra moved through the frozen underbrush with Cole a few steps behind her, both searching for any late-season herbs that might have survived the frost. She hummed softly under her breath, a simple tune with no real words, something she did without thinking, a habit Cole had noticed and quietly grown fond of. "You hum when you're thinking," he observed. Lyra glanced back at him, surprised. "I didn't realize I did that." "You do it often," Cole said, "usually when you're focused on something, or when you're trying not to think about something else." She considered this for a moment, then let out a small laugh. "I suppose it's a habit from childhood. My mother used to hum while she worked. It made hard days feel a little lighter." "She sounds like she was a good woman," Cole said gently. "She was," Lyra agreed, her voice softening with memory. "She always said that kindness costs nothing, but means everything. She believed that no matter how little we had, we could always find something to give someone who had less." Cole was quiet for a moment, watching Lyra crouch down to examine a patch of frozen ground, her fingers brushing away snow to reveal a small cluster of hardy winter herbs beneath. "It seems you took that lesson to heart," he said finally. Lyra shrugged, though a small smile touched her lips. "It's the only inheritance she left me. Seemed ashamed to waste it." They continued their search in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that no longer felt awkward between them, filled instead with an understanding that had grown steadily over their days together. Cole found himself watching her more than he searched the ground himself, noting the careful, deliberate way she moved through the world, always aware, always alert, but never hardened by the difficulty of her circumstances. As they walked back toward her shed later that afternoon, their conversation turned toward lighter topics, stories from Lyra's childhood before her parents passed, memories of small joys she had managed to preserve, despite everything the pack had taken from her. She told him about a festival held every summer near the river, how even Omegas were sometimes allowed to watch from a distance, as the higher-ranked families celebrated, how she used to imagine herself dancing among them despite never being invited to join. "Do you still imagine that?" Cole asked. "Dancing at the festival?" Lyra laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise even her. "Sometimes. It's a silly thing to hold on to." "I don't think it's silly," Cole said, his voice quieter now, more serious. "I think it's important to hold on to some kind of hope, even in circumstances that seem determined to crush it." Lyra looked at him carefully then, something searching in her gaze, as though trying to understand the depth behind his simple words. "You speak like someone who understands more about hardship than a wandering rogue should," she said. Cole felt his chest tighten at the observation, aware of how close she had come to seeing through the careful disguise he maintained. "Everyone carries burdens," he said carefully, choosing his words with precision. "Mine simply look different from yours." Lyra did not press further, though the curiosity remained visible in her expression. She had learned long ago not to demand answers from people who were not ready to give them, understanding intimately how painful it could be to have one's private struggles picked apart by others, who had never walked the same path. As evening approached, they reached her shed, and Lyra busied herself preparing what little food they had gathered that day. Cole watched her work, the fire casting warm light across her face, and felt a familiar ache building in his chest, a longing he had not experienced before, not even with the noble women who had been presented to him over the years as potential matches suitable for a king. "Lyra," he said suddenly, his voice carrying a weight that made her pause and look up at him. "Has anyone in this pack ever truly appreciated what you're worth?" The question caught her off guard, and for a moment, something vulnerable flickered across her features before she composed herself again. "I don't think worth is something Omegas are meant to have here," she said quietly. "At least, not in the eyes of the pack." "That's wrong," Cole said, his voice firmer now, an edge of something fierce beneath the careful control he usually maintained. "Rank should never determine a person's worth. Kindness like yours, strength like yours, that should be valued above status, above blood, above everything this pack claims matters." Lyra stared at him, startled by the intensity in his words, by the certainty with which he spoke, as though he had the authority to declare such things true. "You speak as though you have some say in how packs should be run," she said, half teasing, half genuinely curious. Cole caught himself before answering too quickly, aware of how close he had come to revealing more than he intended. "I've simply seen enough of the world to know that not every pack operates the way this one does," he said, carefully vague. "Some value their people regardless of rank. Some understand that strength comes in many forms, and that kindness is perhaps the rarest and most valuable strength of all." Lyra considered his words in silence for a long moment, something warm and cautiously hopeful blooming in her chest, despite years of learning not to hope for too much. "I'd like to see a pack like that someday," she admitted softly. "One where an Omega isn't defined only by the food she's denied, or the insults she's forced to endure." "You will," Cole said, and the certainty in his voice startled her again, as though he knew something about her future that she could not yet see for herself. "I promise you that, Lyra." She did not know what to make of such a promise from a wandering rogue, with no pack, no status, and seemingly nothing to offer beyond companionship and shared meals. But something in his eyes, steady and unwavering, made her believe him, despite every reason logic gave her not to. That night, after Cole had left, and Lyra lay curled beneath her thin blanket, she found herself thinking about his words, long after she should have fallen asleep. There was something different about this man, something that did not fit the picture of a simple rogue, wandering without purpose. He carried himself with a quiet authority she had never seen in someone without rank, spoke with a confidence that suggested he was accustomed to being heard and obeyed, and looked at her sometimes with an intensity that made her wonder if he saw something in her that she herself had never noticed. She pushed the thoughts aside eventually, telling herself that such questions did not matter, that whatever Cole's past held, he was simply a friend passing through her difficult life, offering companionship during a particularly hard winter. She could not allow herself to hope for anything more, not when hope had been such a fragile and often disappointed thing throughout her entire life. Yet even as she drifted toward sleep, the memory of his voice, steady and certain, promising her a future different from the one she had always expected, lingered in her mind, like the last warm ember of a dying fire, refusing entirely to go out. Miles away, in the hidden cave that had become his temporary shelter, Kalen Ashford stared up at the rough stone ceiling above him, wrestling with a decision that grew heavier with each passing day. His wounds had healed enough now that he could easily return to his territory, reclaim his throne, and begin dismantling the corruption he had already gathered enough evidence to expose. There was no longer any practical reason to remain hidden in the Blackthorn lands. And yet the thought of leaving Lyra behind, of returning to his golden halls while she remained trapped in a shed, at the edge of a pack that starved her, felt like abandoning something he was no longer capable of walking away from. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since his ambush, allowed himself to imagine a future where the Alpha King and the forgotten Omega were not separated by circumstance, rank, or the careful deception he had woven around his true identity. It was a dangerous thought, one that could complicate everything he had built, everything he was responsible for, as ruler of the Northern Territories. But as sleep finally claimed him, the image of Lyra's face, warm and unguarded in the firelight, followed him into his dreams, refusing to be dismissed, no matter how carefully he tried to reason it away. A horn sounded across the Blackthorn territory on the morning of the midwinter gathering, calling every wolf in the pack toward the central hall for a ceremony held once each year to honor the strongest hunters and celebrate the pack's survival through the harshest months. Attendance was required of everyone, regardless of rank, and Lyra dressed in her cleanest, though still threadbare clothing, before making her way toward the gathering with the same quiet resignation she carried into every pack event. Cole watched from a distance as she approached the central hall, positioning himself near the edge of the crowd where his presence would draw the least attention. He had grown skilled at blending into gatherings like this over the past weeks, careful never to stand too close to anyone who might recognize authority in his bearing, despite his simple clothing. The ceremony began as it always did, with Alpha Garrick Voss standing at the head of the hall, broad-shouldered and imposing, his voice booming as he praised the pack's strongest hunters and warriors for their contributions through the season. Cole watched the proceedings with careful attention, noting how the Alpha's praise flowed generously toward those already favored, while wolves of lower rank stood silent and overlooked at the edges of the hall, their contributions unremarked, despite the labor that surely sustained the pack just as much as any hunter's kill. When the formal praise concluded, tables were brought forward laden with food, a feast meant to celebrate the pack's survival through winter's hardest stretch. Cole watched as the higher-ranked families moved forward first, filling their plates generously, while the lower-ranked wolves waited at a respectful distance, understanding without being told that they would receive whatever remained once their betters had eaten their fill. Lyra stood near the back of the gathering, patient and unassuming, waiting her turn as she always did. Cole felt his jaw tighten as he watched her wait, knowing how little would likely remain by the time the line reached her position, knowing how thin she had grown over the winter months, from meals that barely sustained her. It was Vanessa Voss who noticed her first, the Alpha's daughter moving through the crowd with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. She stopped in front of Lyra, her expression curling into something cold and mocking. "Still here, are you?" Vanessa said, loud enough that several nearby wolves turned to watch. "I would have thought the cold might have finally done what the rest of us have been too polite to do ourselves." Laughter rippled through the small crowd that had gathered to watch, cruel and careless, the kind of laughter that came easily to those who had never known real hardship themselves. Lyra kept her eyes lowered, her expression carefully neutral, a skill born from years of practice in absorbing cruelty, without letting it show how deeply it cut. "I've survived worse winters," Lyra said quietly, her voice steady, despite the humiliation burning beneath her calm exterior. "Have you?" Vanessa said, stepping closer, her voice dropping into something sharper, more deliberate. "Funny, because I heard you've been seen wandering the border territories with some rogue. Perhaps that explains why you still have color in your cheeks despite how little food you're given. Perhaps you've found other ways to feed yourself." The implication in her words was unmistakable, cruel and calculated to humiliate Lyra in front of the entire gathered pack. Lyra felt heat rise in her face, not from embarrassment at the suggestion itself, which held no truth, but from the deliberate cruelty behind Vanessa's words, designed to strip away whatever small dignity Lyra had managed to preserve for herself. Cole, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt something dark and dangerous coil tight in his chest. Every instinct honed through years of leadership screamed at him to step forward, to silence this cruel display with the full weight of authority he normally carried without question. But revealing himself now would expose everything, would put both himself and Lyra in a position of vulnerability neither of them could afford, while the corruption he had come to investigate remained unresolved. He forced himself to remain still, his hands clenched at his sides, watching as Lyra absorbed the humiliation without retaliation, her composure a testament to strength that most in that hall could never have understood or appreciated. "I've done nothing to be ashamed of," Lyra said finally, her voice quiet but unwavering. "And I owe you no explanation for how I choose to spend my time." Something flickered across Vanessa's face, surprise perhaps at the quiet defiance in Lyra's response, quickly replaced by irritation. "Careful, Omega," Vanessa said, her voice dropping into something colder still. "You forget your place too easily these days. Perhaps a reminder is in order." She reached out suddenly, knocking the small wooden bowl from Lyra's hands before she had even had the chance to receive any food, sending it clattering to the ground, empty and forgotten among the trampled snow. Cole moved before he could stop himself, taking 2 quick steps forward before catching his own reaction and forcing himself to halt. Around him, several wolves had turned to watch the confrontation, some with expressions of quiet discomfort at Vanessa's cruelty, others with the careless amusement of those who had grown accustomed to such displays and no longer questioned them. Lyra knelt slowly to retrieve the fallen bowl, her expression carefully blank, refusing to give Vanessa the satisfaction of visible distress. "Enjoy your feast," Lyra said quietly, straightening with what remained of her dignity intact, before turning and walking away from the gathering without waiting for a response. Cole watched her go, every muscle in his body tight with restrained fury, understanding now with painful clarity the reality of what Lyra endured daily within this pack, that valued rank above basic decency. He waited a careful interval before following at a discreet distance, catching up to her once she had moved beyond the immediate view of the gathering. "Lyra," he called softly. She turned, and for a brief moment before she composed herself, Cole saw the raw hurt behind her, carefully maintained calm, quickly hidden away, as she straightened her shoulders and forced a small, tired smile. "You saw that," she said, not quite a question. "I did," Cole said, his voice tight with an anger he struggled to fully contain. "Lyra, that was unacceptable. No one should be treated the way she just treated you." "It's not the first time," Lyra said, with a weary acceptance that struck Cole harder than the cruelty itself had. "It won't be the last either. This is simply how things are here." "It shouldn't be," Cole said fiercely. "Rank should never give anyone the right to treat another person that way. You deserve so much better than what this pack has given you." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, something searching in her gaze, as though trying once again to understand the depth of conviction behind his words. Conviction that seemed far too strong for a wandering rogue with no standing of his own. "You speak as though you have the power to change how things are here," she said softly. Cole hesitated, aware once again of how close he had come to revealing the truth of his identity, the truth that would change everything between them, the moment it was spoken aloud. "Perhaps I don't have that power yet," he said carefully, choosing each word with deliberate caution. "But I promise you, Lyra, this will not always be your life. You will not always be treated as though your worth depends on your rank." "You keep making promises like that," Lyra said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Promises you have no way of keeping." "I intend to keep every one of them," Cole said, his voice quiet but absolute, carrying a certainty that seemed to reach beyond the simple circumstances of their present moment. "You'll see." Lyra did not know what to make of such certainty from a man with seemingly nothing to his name, but something in his steady gaze made her want, despite every hard lesson life had taught her, to believe him. She said nothing further, simply nodding once, before continuing on toward her shed, leaving Cole standing alone in the snow, watching her retreating figure with a resolve hardening inside him, that had nothing to do with his original mission in these lands, and everything to do with the woman who had captured his heart, without either of them fully realizing it had happened. That evening, alone in his hidden shelter, Kalen Ashford made a decision that would set in motion everything that followed. He would remain in the Blackthorn territory, not merely to complete his investigation into the corruption spreading through allied packs, but to ensure that Lyra never again endured the kind of casual cruelty he had witnessed that day. He did not yet know how he would reveal his identity, or when the right moment would come, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that he would not leave these lands until Lyra's suffering had ended for good. He sent a second message to his advisor that night, this one carrying instructions to quietly investigate the standing and history of the Blackthorn Pack's leadership, information he suspected would prove useful before this was all finished. Something told him that Alpha Garrick Voss and his family had far more to answer for than simple cruelty toward an overlooked Omega, and Kalen intended to uncover every piece of that truth before he was done. Snow fell steadily for 3 days after the midwinter gathering, thick enough that even the most determined hunters in the Blackthorn Pack stayed close to the central lodge, waiting for the storm to pass before venturing out again. Lyra used the time to mend the worn seams of her only coat, her fingers stiff from cold as she worked a bone needle through fraying fabric by the light of a small fire that barely held back the chill of her shed. She had not seen Cole since the gathering, and though she told herself his absence meant nothing, a small worry had begun to gnaw at her thoughts. Rogues moved on, she reminded herself. That was simply the nature of wolves without a pack. He owed her nothing, certainly not an explanation for wherever he had gone. On the fourth morning, when the snow finally eased into a gentle drift and the sky cleared to a pale, washed-out blue, Lyra ventured out to check her snares, hoping the storm had not destroyed what little she had managed to set up before the weather turned. She moved carefully through drifts that reached nearly to her knees in places, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. She found Cole waiting near her first snare, looking thinner than she remembered, though his eyes brightened noticeably when he saw her approaching. "I was starting to worry," Lyra admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of the confession. "I had to stay hidden during the storm," Cole said, which was partly true, though the greater truth was that he had spent those days coordinating with Nolan Price, his most trusted advisor, who had finally located him through the network of hawks and messengers loyal to the crown. Nolan's information had confirmed Kaelin's growing suspicions about corruption within several allied pacts, information that would prove critical once he finally returned to claim his throne. "You look tired," Lyra observed, studying the faint shadows beneath his eyes. "It's been a difficult few days," Cole admitted, which was an understatement given the weight of decisions pressing on him. Decisions about timing, about strategy, about how much longer he could reasonably delay his return without risking further instability within his territory. They worked together, checking the snares, finding only modest success. A single thin hair that would need to stretch across several meals if Lyra hoped to make it last. As they walked back toward her shed, the silence between them carried a different quality than usual. Heavier somehow, weighted with things neither of them had yet found the courage to say aloud. "Lyra," Cole said finally, stopping just outside her shed, his expression more serious than she had seen it before. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." She turned to face him fully, something in his tone making her stomach tighten with uncertain anticipation. "Of course," she said. "If you had the chance to leave this pack, to leave behind everyone who has ever treated you poorly, everyone who has made you feel less than you deserve, would you take it?" The question caught her completely off guard, and she considered it carefully before answering, understanding somehow that her response mattered more than the simple words themselves. "I've thought about leaving many times," she admitted slowly. "But where would I go? A lone Omega without pack protection faces far greater dangers than hunger. At least here, despite everything, I have some measure of safety, even if it comes at the cost of dignity." "What if safety and dignity didn't have to be separate things?" Cole asked, his voice quiet but intense. "What if there was a place where you could have both?" Lyra studied him carefully, searching his face for some clue to the meaning behind his questions. "Do you know of such a place?" she asked. Cole hesitated, aware once again of how close he stood to revealing everything. The truth of his identity, the reality of the kingdom he ruled, the position he could offer her, if only circumstances allowed him to speak plainly. But the timing still felt wrong, the corruption within these territories still unresolved, and revealing himself now, before he understood the full scope of what he was dealing with, could put Lyra in greater danger than she currently faced. "I believe such places exist," he said carefully. "I simply need more time before I can offer you a path toward one." Lyra nodded slowly, though confusion remained evident in her expression. Before she could press further, a commotion sounded from the direction of the central packlands, raised voices carrying across the snow-covered distance between them and the main lodge. "Something's happening," Lyra said, concern immediately overtaking her curiosity about Cole's cryptic words. They moved quickly toward the source of the noise, arriving to find a small crowd gathered near the pack's storage cellars, where the community's shared grain reserves were kept for the harshest months of winter. Alpha Garrick Voss stood at the center of the commotion, his face flushed with anger, shouting accusations at a young hunter who cowered before him, insisting he had witnessed someone stealing from the reserves during the recent storm. "Someone has been taking from stores meant for the entire pack," Garrick bellowed, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd, "and I intend to find out who is responsible before another ounce of food goes missing." Cole felt a cold dread settle in his stomach as he watched the scene unfold, some instinct warning him of where this accusation might eventually be directed. His suspicion proved correct moments later, when Vanessa Voss stepped forward, her expression carrying a calculated satisfaction that immediately put Cole on alert. "Father," Vanessa said, her voice carrying easily over the crowd's murmuring, "I believe I know who might be responsible. Lyra has been seen wandering the border territories with some rogue for weeks now. Perhaps their little friendship involves more than simple company." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Cole watched with rising horror as every eye turned toward Lyra, who stood frozen beside him, her expression a mixture of shock and dawning fear at the direction this accusation was taking. "That's a lie," Lyra said, her voice steady, despite the fear evident in her wide eyes. "I have taken nothing from the pack stores. I would never do such a thing. And yet you've grown thinner, rather than fatter these past weeks," Vanessa said with false sympathy, which one might expect if you were sharing stolen food with an outsider, rather than eating it yourself. The twisted logic of the accusation, designed to appear reasonable while being built entirely on malicious speculation, made Cole's blood run cold with fury. He understood immediately what was happening. Vanessa had found a way to weaponize Lyra's association with him, using it to construct an accusation that could result in severe punishment for a crime Lyra had not committed. Alpha Garrick turned his attention toward Lyra, his expression hardening with suspicion, fed by his daughter's careful manipulation. "Is this true?" he demanded. "Have you been seen with a rogue near our borders?" "I have helped an injured traveler," Lyra said carefully, refusing to lie, despite the danger evident in the Alpha's tone. "But I have taken nothing from this pack's stores to share with him or anyone else." "A likely story," Garrick growled. "An Omega with a secret companion, growing suspiciously well-fed while our reserves mysteriously diminish. The connection seems clear enough to me." Cole stepped forward before he could stop himself, unable to remain silent, while Lyra faced punishment for a crime built entirely on fabrication. "She's telling the truth," he said, his voice carrying more authority than the simple rogue disguise should have allowed. "I am the traveler she speaks of, and I can assure you she has taken nothing from your stores. What little food we've shared has come from what she gathers herself, roots and small game, nothing more." The crowd turned their attention toward Cole now, and he felt the weight of dozens of suspicious eyes assessing him, a stranger suddenly inserting himself into pack business. Alpha Garrick studied him with narrowed eyes, clearly unaccustomed to being contradicted by someone with no standing or rank. "And why should I believe the word of a wandering rogue over evidence of missing supplies?" Garrick demanded. "Because it's the truth," Cole said firmly, meeting the Alpha's gaze without flinching, an unconscious authority radiating from him that seemed to give even the powerful Alpha momentary pause. "And punishing an innocent woman for a crime she did not commit will not solve whatever actual problem exists within your storage systems." Something flickered across Garrick's face, uncertainty perhaps, though it was quickly buried beneath renewed anger at being challenged in front of his gathered pack. "This is not your concern, stranger," Garrick snapped. "You have no standing here, no right to interfere in matters of pack justice." Cole felt every instinct screaming at him, to reveal the truth in that moment, to announce his true identity, and end this injustice with the full authority his birthright commanded. But even now, with Lyra facing potential punishment, some careful, strategic part of his mind held him back, recognizing that revealing himself prematurely could create complications neither he nor Lyra were prepared to handle, especially with the corruption investigation still incomplete, and his own guard not yet positioned to protect them both from whatever backlash such a revelation might provoke. "Perhaps," Cole said instead, forcing his voice into something calmer, more measured. "You might investigate further, before assigning punishment, based on speculation alone. Question the guards who watched the stores during the storm. Examine whether the missing amount truly matches what two people could realistically consume. The truth, I believe, will exonerate her completely." Garrick studied Cole for a long, tense moment, clearly weighing the stranger's unexpected confidence against his own authority as Alpha. Finally, with visible reluctance, he turned back toward the crowd. "The investigation will continue," he announced. "Until concrete proof emerges, no punishment will be issued. But know this," he added, his gaze sweeping back toward Lyra with lingering suspicion. "If evidence points toward your involvement, the consequences will be severe." The crowd began to disperse slowly, murmuring amongst themselves, and Lyra stood frozen for a long moment, before finally releasing a shaky breath, the tension of the confrontation visibly draining from her posture. Cole moved to her side immediately, his hand hovering near her arm without quite touching her, uncertain if comfort would be welcome after such a public ordeal. "Thank you," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling slightly with the aftermath of fear she had carefully suppressed during the confrontation itself. "You didn't have to defend me like that. You put yourself at risk." "I would do far more than that to protect you," Cole said quietly, the words carrying a depth of feeling he had not intended to reveal so plainly. Lyra looked up at him, something shifting in her expression as their eyes met, a recognition passing between them that neither could quite name, but both felt with startling clarity. For a moment, standing there in the aftermath of danger narrowly avoided, the careful distance they had maintained between friendship and something deeper seemed to dissolve entirely. Neither of them spoke of it directly, but as they walked back toward her shed in comfortable, charged silence, both carried the unmistakable knowledge that whatever existed between them had grown into something far more significant than simple companionship shared during a difficult winter. The days following the confrontation at the storage cellars carried a tense quality that Lyra could not fully shake, an awareness of eyes watching her more closely than before, whispers following her through the packlands that she had learned to ignore over years, but which now carried a sharper edge of danger. Vanessa's accusation, though unproven, had planted seeds of suspicion that lingered despite the Alpha's decision to withhold immediate punishment. Cole noticed the change too, the careful way Lyra now moved through pack territory, avoiding gatherings where possible, keeping her interactions brief and guarded. He hated what this accusation had cost her, the added weight of suspicion layered atop the neglect she had already endured for years, and he found himself growing increasingly restless with the constraints of his hidden identity. Nolan Price arrived at Cole's shelter one evening, having finally tracked his king through the network of careful signals and trusted contacts scattered across the Northern Territories. The advisor's relief at finding Kalen alive was evident, though quickly overtaken by urgency once he began sharing what his investigation had uncovered. "The corruption runs deeper than we initially suspected," Nolan reported, spreading a collection of documents across the floor of the small shelter. "Several pack leaders, including Alpha Garrick Voss, of this very territory, have been diverting resources meant for their people, claiming shortages that don't actually exist, while selling the surplus to outside buyers for personal profit." Cole studied the documents carefully, anger building steadily, as the evidence confirmed suspicions that had been forming since his arrival in these lands. "The missing supplies from the storage cellars," he said slowly, understanding dawning with painful clarity. "That accusation against Lyra wasn't about a genuine theft at all, was it?" "Based on what I've uncovered," Nolan said grimly, "the actual missing supplies were sold by Garrick himself, likely to cover the financial strain of maintaining appearances befitting his status, while his true resources have been quietly disappearing into private accounts for months. The accusation against your friend may have been a convenient distraction, or perhaps genuine suspicion born from Vanessa's personal cruelty. But either way, the true thief within this pack has always been its own leadership." The revelation settled heavily over Cole, understanding now the full scope of injustice Lyra had nearly suffered, punished potentially for a crime committed by the very authority meant to protect and provide for the pack's most vulnerable members. His resolve hardened further, the timeline for revealing his true identity accelerating in his mind as the pieces of corruption fell into clearer focus. "How much longer until we have enough evidence to act decisively?" Cole asked. "Days, perhaps a week at most," Nolan replied. "But my king, I must express concern about the risks of remaining here, undisguised for much longer. Whoever orchestrated the ambush that nearly killed you remains unaccounted for, and if word spreads that you survive and continue investigating these territories, you may find yourself facing another attempt on your life, before we've gathered sufficient proof to bring the guilty parties to justice." Cole absorbed this warning with the careful consideration it deserved, weighing the risks against his growing certainty that he could not simply abandon Lyra to a pack whose very leadership had proven itself corrupt and cruel. "I understand the danger," he said finally, "but I will not leave until I've ensured her safety, and until this pack's true leadership has been exposed for what they truly are." Nolan studied his king for a long moment, something knowing in his expression, as though he had already guessed the deeper reasons behind Kalen's reluctance to leave these particular lands. "This Lyra," he said carefully, "she must be quite remarkable to hold your attention so completely, even amidst matters of such political importance." "She is," Cole said simply, offering no further explanation, though the quiet certainty in his voice told Nolan everything he needed to understand about his king's changed priorities. After Nolan departed to continue gathering evidence, Cole made his way toward Lyra's shed under cover of darkness, needing to see her, to reassure himself of her safety, after learning the true depth of danger she had unknowingly faced. He found her awake despite the late hour, sitting near her small fire, her expression troubled in a way that immediately concerned him. "You're up late," he observed, settling beside her near the modest warmth of the flames. "I couldn't sleep," Lyra admitted. "Vanessa cornered me again today, near the river. She made it clear that she still believes I'm responsible for the missing supplies, regardless of what her father decided. She said she intends to find proof, whatever that might mean. Cole felt anger flare hot in his chest at this continued harassment, knowing now that the true culprit behind the missing supplies was Vanessa's own father, and that Lyra remained trapped in danger, built entirely on the corruption of the pack's leadership, rather than any wrongdoing of her own. "Lyra," he said carefully, "I need you to trust me when I say that the truth about those missing supplies will come to light soon, and it will prove your innocence beyond any doubt." She looked at him with a mixture of hope and confusion. "How can you be so certain?" "I have my reasons," Cole said, the weight of unspoken truth heavy in his chest. "I promise you, this nightmare will end soon, and you will never again have to fear false accusations from people who have never deserved the power they hold over your life." Lyra studied him carefully, something in his tone carrying a certainty that seemed to reach beyond simple reassurance from a friend, with no real influence over pack matters. "Cole," she said slowly, "who are you, really? I've noticed things, small things, the way you speak sometimes, the way you carry yourself when you think no one is watching closely. You are not simply a wandering rogue, are you?" The question hung heavy in the air between them, and Cole felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the choice between continued deception and a truth that would irrevocably change everything between them. Every strategic instinct told him the timing remained wrong, that revealing himself now, before the corruption within this pack had been fully exposed and dismantled, could place Lyra in greater danger rather than less. "There are things about my past I cannot share yet," Cole said carefully, watching disappointment flicker briefly across her face before she composed herself again. "But I promise you, Lyra, everything will make sense soon. I only ask that you trust me a little longer." "I do trust you," Lyra said softly, and the simple honesty of her admission struck Cole harder than any elaborate declaration could have. "That's precisely why the mystery troubles me. I've learned throughout my life to be cautious with trust, yet somehow, you've earned mine without even trying." Cole reached out then, his hand finding hers where it rested near the fire, his fingers closing gently around her own. The moment their skin touched, something powerful and unmistakable surged between them, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire's modest heat, a recognition that seemed to settle deep into both their bones simultaneously. Lyra gasped softly, her eyes widening as she looked down at their joined hands and back up to Cole's face, clearly startled by the intensity of whatever had just passed between them. "What was that?" she whispered. Cole felt his heart pounding, understanding with sudden, overwhelming clarity exactly what had just occurred, a recognition he had not expected, had not prepared himself for despite every private hope he had harbored these past weeks, without fully acknowledging them. "Lyra," he said, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer fully contain, "I believe we need to talk about something far more important than my past." She stared at him, breathless, her hand still held gently within his own, waiting for whatever revelation he seemed poised to share, unaware that the very foundation of both their lives was about to shift entirely, reshaping everything she thought she understood about herself, about him, and about the future that had just quietly, irrevocably become intertwined between them. The silence stretched between them, charged and trembling, as Lyra waited for Cole to explain the strange, powerful sensation that had passed between them the moment their hands touched. She had heard stories of such bonds, whispered tales among the pack about fated mates, connections so rare that most wolves lived their entire lives without ever experiencing one. She had never allowed herself to hope for something so extraordinary, understanding that Omegas rarely factored into such fortunate destinies. "That feeling," Cole said slowly, choosing his words with careful deliberation, "is something I did not expect, though perhaps some part of me has hoped for it, since the very first night we met." "Are you saying," Lyra whispered, hardly daring to voice the possibility aloud, "that we are fated mates?" Cole nodded, his expression a complicated mixture of wonder and lingering anxiety about everything this revelation would eventually require him to explain. "I believe so," he said. "I have never felt anything like what just passed between us. It confirms something I have suspected for weeks now, though I did not want to burden you with such a significant claim until I was certain." Lyra felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by an emotion too complex to fully name, joy tangled together with disbelief, and a lingering fear that something this good could not possibly last, given everything else in her life. How is this possible? She asked. I am an Omega. Fate does not usually concern itself with wolves like me. Fate does not care about rank, Cole said firmly, his hand tightening gently around hers. It cares only about the true nature of a person's heart. And your heart, Lyra, is more remarkable than any I have encountered in my entire life. She looked at him carefully, something shifting in her expression as understanding began to dawn, pieces of information she had gathered over their weeks together, finally beginning to align into a picture that made her breath catch. Cole, she said slowly, who exactly are you? Before he could answer, a sharp sound cut through the night outside her shed, the unmistakable snap of a branch breaking underfoot, followed immediately by low voices speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Cole's entire demeanor shifted instantly, years of training and instinct overriding the tender vulnerability of the moment before, as he rose swiftly to his feet, positioning himself protectively between Lyra and the shed's entrance. Stay behind me, he said, his voice suddenly carrying an authority far removed from the gentle rogue persona he had maintained for weeks. The door to Lyra's shed burst open moments later, revealing 3 armed men she did not recognize, their expressions hard and purposeful, clearly not wolves from within the Blackthorn pack itself. Lyra's heart pounded with sudden terror, understanding immediately that these strangers posed a danger far beyond anything she had previously faced. There he is, one of the men said, his eyes narrowing on Cole with unmistakable recognition. The king survived after all. Someone will pay dearly for that failure. The word king struck Lyra like a physical blow, her mind scrambling to process the implication, even as the immediate danger demanded her full attention. Cole moved swiftly, positioning himself even more protectively in front of her, his posture shifting into something fierce and commanding that bore no resemblance to the gentle rogue she had come to know over these past weeks. You've made a grave mistake coming here, Cole said, his voice carrying a cold authority that silenced any doubt Lyra might have harbored about the true nature of his identity. Whatever you were sent to finish, you will not succeed tonight. The 3 men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not having anticipated finding their target alert and prepared for confrontation, rather than the weakened, easily overcome prey they had expected, based on outdated information about his injuries. But greed or desperation apparently outweighed their hesitation, and the largest of the 3 lunged forward with a blade drawn, aiming directly for Cole's exposed side. What followed happened faster than Lyra could fully process, her mind reeling as Cole moved with a speed and precision that spoke of extensive training, far beyond what any simple traveler could possess. He disarmed the first attacker within seconds, using the man's own momentum against him, before turning swiftly to intercept the second assailant, who had circled toward Lyra's position, clearly intending to use her as leverage against their true target. Lyra, despite her fear, was not entirely helpless. Years of survival in a pack that offered her no protection had taught her to think quickly under pressure, and she seized a heavy piece of firewood from beside the hearth, swinging it with desperate force against the second attacker's arm, just as he reached for her. The man cried out, staggering back, and Cole finished the confrontation swiftly, subduing him alongside his companion within moments. The third attacker, seeing his companions overwhelmed so quickly, turned and fled into the darkness beyond the shed, disappearing into the tree line before Cole could pursue him. Silence fell heavy over the small shed once the immediate danger had passed, broken only by Lyra's ragged breathing as she processed the violence that had just unfolded within her own modest home. Cole turned to her immediately, his expression a mixture of fierce protectiveness and deep concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his hands hovering near her shoulders without quite touching, as though afraid of causing further distress after the trauma of the attack. "I'm fine," Lyra managed, though her voice trembled slightly with the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "But Cole, that man called you king. What does that mean?" Cole exhaled slowly, understanding that the moment for deception had finally, irrevocably passed. There was no way to continue hiding his true identity after what had just occurred. No reasonable explanation for the skill and authority he had just demonstrated that would not eventually lead back to the same inevitable truth. "My name is not Cole," he said quietly, meeting her gaze directly, despite the vulnerability of the confession. "My true name is Kalen Ashford, and I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories." The words settled over Lyra like a physical weight, understanding crashing through her in waves, as pieces of the past weeks reassembled themselves into an entirely different picture. The confidence he carried, despite his rogue disguise, the survival skills too refined for a simple wanderer, the way even the alpha of her own pack had hesitated when confronted by his quiet authority. It all made sense now, terrifying and overwhelming sense. "You're the king," she whispered, disbelief evident in her trembling voice. "The Alpha King. And I gave you my last piece of bread thinking you were simply a starving stranger." "You gave me far more than bread that night," Kalen said gently, moving closer despite her visible shock, his hand finally reaching to cup her cheek with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the fierce warrior who had just subdued 3 armed attackers. "You gave me kindness, with absolutely no expectation of anything in return, at a time when I had nothing to offer you but a name I wasn't even brave enough to give you truthfully. You showed me what it truly means to have a good heart, Lyra, and that gift matters more to me than any crown or title I hold." Tears spilled freely down Lyra's cheeks now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of everything unfolding around her, the revelation of his true identity, the confirmed truth of their fated bond, the violence that had nearly claimed both their lives moments before. "I don't understand how any of this is possible," she admitted. "I am nothing. An Omega with no status, no family, no worth within my own pack. How could someone like you be fated to someone like me?" "You are not nothing," Kalen said fiercely, his hands framing her face now, his eyes blazing with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever encountered, Lyra. Your kindness, your strength, your resilience in the face of suffering that would have broken lesser souls, these qualities make you more worthy of respect and honor than any title or rank could ever provide. I do not care that this pack has failed to see your true value. I see it clearly, and I intend to ensure that the entire world recognizes it as well." Lyra could hardly breathe beneath the weight of his words, beneath the certainty in his gaze, beneath the impossible truth that the Alpha King of the Northern Territories had just declared her his fated mate, his equal, worthy of a devotion she had never dared to imagine for herself. "What happens now?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Kalen's expression hardened with fresh resolve, the tenderness of the moment giving way to the fierce determination of a ruler, prepared to reshape circumstances that had wronged the woman he loved. "Now," he said, "the deception ends. Tomorrow, the entire Blackthorn pack will learn exactly who has been living among them these past weeks, and exactly how they have failed the woman fate chose for their true king." Dawn broke cold and clear over the Blackthorn territory, the sky washed in pale gold light that seemed almost too gentle for the storm about to unfold within the pack's borders. Kalen had spent the remaining hours of night coordinating with Nolan, who arrived before sunrise with a full contingent of royal guards, their polished armor and disciplined bearing an unmistakable contrast to the ragged rogue disguise Kalen had worn for weeks. Word spread through the packlands like wildfire the moment the royal procession became visible approaching the central lodge, wolves abandoning their morning tasks to gather and witness whatever remarkable event had brought armed soldiers bearing the crest of the Northern Territories into their humble territory. Whispers of confusion and alarm rippled through the crowd as they struggled to understand the meaning behind such an unexpected arrival. Lyra stood beside Kalen near the front of the gathering crowd, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervous anticipation and lingering disbelief at everything that had unfolded in the span of a single night. She wore the same simple, threadbare clothing she always wore, feeling acutely out of place beside the man now dressed in the fine, dark clothing his guards had brought for him, every inch the powerful ruler she now understood him to be. Alpha Garrick Voss emerged from the central lodge, his expression a mixture of confusion and barely concealed alarm as he took in the sight of royal soldiers standing at attention within his territory. Beside him, Vanessa's face had drained of color, her earlier confidence replaced by visible unease as she recognized the gravity of whatever situation was unfolding. "What is the meaning of this?" Garrick demanded, though his voice carried none of the commanding authority he typically wielded within his own lands, clearly unsettled by the unexpected presence of forces far beyond his own modest command. Kalen stepped forward, and the transformation in his bearing was immediate and unmistakable, every trace of the humble rogue disguise falling away as he stood with the full authority of his true position. "Alpha Garrick Voss," he said, his voice carrying easily across the stunned crowd. "You stand before Kalen Ashford, Alpha King of the Northern Territories." Gasps rippled through the assembled pack, disbelief and shock evident on every face, as they struggled to reconcile the ragged rogue some of them had glimpsed, wandering their borders with the powerful ruler, now standing before them, his identity confirmed by the royal guards flanking his position and the unmistakable authority radiating from his every word. "Your Majesty," Garrick stammered, dropping immediately into a deep bow, his earlier confidence utterly replaced by desperate deference. "I had no idea, forgive my ignorance, had I known." "Had you known?" Kalen interrupted coldly. "You would have treated me with the same respect you reserve for those you deem worthy of your attention, while continuing to neglect and mistreat those you consider beneath your notice. That, Alpha Voss, is precisely the problem I have come to address." Confusion rippled through the crowd, murmurs building as they struggled to understand the connection between the king's arrival and whatever grievance he seemed prepared to address. Vanessa, standing beside her father, had gone pale with dawning horror, as understanding began to settle over her. "I have spent these past weeks disguised within your territory," Kalen continued, his voice hardening further, "investigating corruption I suspected was spreading through packs allied to my crown. During that time, I discovered far more than simple financial mismanagement, Alpha Voss. I discovered a pack whose leadership has systematically neglected its most vulnerable members, while indulging in privileges built on stolen resources." He turned then, extending his hand toward Lyra, who stepped forward hesitantly, acutely aware of hundreds of eyes now fixed upon her with an intensity she had never before experienced within this pack, that had spent years pretending she did not exist. "This woman," Kalen said, his voice softening slightly, even as it carried across the crowd with unmistakable authority, "found me starving and wounded in the snow, weeks ago, after an ambush nearly claimed my life. She did not know my identity. She owed me nothing. Yet she gave me the last piece of bread she owned, sharing what little she had, without a single question about who I was, or what I could offer her in return." The crowd's murmuring intensified, understanding beginning to dawn as they connected the humble Omega they had overlooked for years with the remarkable act of kindness the king now described so plainly before them all. "While I remained hidden within your borders," Kalen continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd with cold precision, "I witnessed how this pack treats its Omegas, its lowest-ranked members, individuals who contribute just as meaningfully to this community's survival as any hunter or warrior, yet who are denied basic dignity and sustenance based solely on accident of birth. I witnessed Lyra humiliated publicly, accused falsely of theft, denied food while others feasted, treated as though her worth mattered less than the very dirt beneath your feet." He turned his attention directly toward Vanessa now, whose composure had crumbled entirely beneath the weight of his cold, assessing gaze. "I also discovered," he continued, "that the missing supplies from your storage cellars, supplies you were so eager to blame on an innocent woman, were in fact diverted by your own father, sold for personal profit, while claiming false shortages to the very pack he was sworn to protect and provide for." The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive, shock and outrage rippling through the gathered wolves as they processed this devastating revelation about their own leadership's corruption. Garrick's face had gone ashen, any attempt at denial dying in his throat beneath the weight of evidence he clearly understood the king already possessed. "Your Majesty," Garrick began desperately, "I can explain." "You will have every opportunity to explain," Kalen said coldly, "before a formal tribunal that will determine the full consequences of your corruption. But know this, Alpha Voss. Your position as leader of this pack is hereby suspended, effective immediately, pending full investigation into your conduct and the conduct of your family." Vanessa let out a strangled sound of protest, but a single sharp look from Kalen silenced whatever objection she had intended to voice. The crowd remained utterly silent now, absorbing the magnitude of what was unfolding before them, the complete reversal of power and standing occurring within their own community in the span of mere minutes. Kalen turned back toward Lyra then, and his expression softened dramatically, the cold authority of a moment before giving way to something tender and deeply personal, as he took her hand gently within his own, displaying the gesture openly before the entire stunned assembly. "This woman," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with the harsh judgment he had just delivered, "is my fated mate, confirmed through a bond I have never before experienced in my life. She will stand beside me as Luna of the Northern Territories, and any wolf within these lands or beyond who fails to show her the respect and honor she deserves, will answer directly to me." The crowd's shock deepened further, disbelief evident on every face, as they struggled to reconcile the forgotten Omega they had spent years neglecting, with the future Luna now standing before them, hand in hand with the most powerful ruler in the region. Somewhere within the crowd, Lyra caught sight of wolves, who had once mocked her openly, now staring with expressions of stunned, uncertain reassessment, understanding perhaps for the first time the grave error of their previous cruelty. "This pack," Kalen continued, addressing the crowd directly now, "will undergo significant reform under new leadership that I will personally oversee, until a suitable replacement can be properly vetted and installed. Never again will an Omega within these lands go hungry while others feast. Never again will rank determine whether a person receives basic dignity and respect. The corruption and cruelty I have witnessed here ends today." As his words settled over the stunned assembly, Lyra felt the weight of the moment pressing down upon her, overwhelming and surreal in equal measure. Weeks ago she had been an invisible Omega, forgotten and neglected by a pack that saw no value in her existence beyond whatever meager labor she could provide. Now she stood beside the Alpha King himself, publicly declared his fated mate, witnessing the complete collapse of the very system that had oppressed her for years. She looked up at Kalen, searching his face for some sign of the gentle stranger she had first met beneath the oak tree, and found him there still, beneath the crown and the authority, and the fierce protectiveness he now displayed so openly. He squeezed her hand gently, offering a small, reassuring smile amid the chaos of the moment, a silent promise that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. "Are you ready for what comes now?" he asked quietly, his voice meant only for her, amid the continuing murmur of the shocked crowd. Lyra took a steadying breath, drawing strength from years of quiet resilience that had carried her through hardship most people could never have imagined enduring. "I've survived worse than uncertainty," she said softly. "I think I can manage becoming a Luna." Kalen's smile deepened at her quiet courage, pride evident in his expression as he looked upon the remarkable woman fate had chosen to stand beside him. "You will do far more than manage," he said. "You will transform what it means to lead with kindness, Lyra. I have no doubt of that whatsoever." In the days that followed the king's dramatic revelation, the Blackthorn pack existed in a state of uneasy transformation, its usual rhythms disrupted by the sudden collapse of leadership that had governed these lands for generations. Garrick Voss remained confined under guard within his own lodge, awaiting the formal tribunal that would determine the full consequences of his corruption, while Vanessa found herself stripped of the privileges and status she had wielded so carelessly against those beneath her. Kalen established a temporary command post within the central lodge, working alongside Nolan and a small team of trusted advisors to untangle the full scope of financial mismanagement and cruelty that had characterized Garrick's leadership. Evidence continued mounting daily, revealing a pattern of neglect that stretched back years, affecting not only Lyra, but numerous other Omegas and lower-ranked wolves, who had suffered quietly, under a system designed to benefit only those already favored by birth or status. Lyra found herself in an unfamiliar position during these days, no longer confined to the margins of pack life, but not yet fully settled into whatever role awaited her as the king's declared mate. She spent much of her time observing Kalen as he worked, marveling at the careful precision with which he approached even the most complicated political challenges, the fairness he insisted upon even when dealing with wolves who had shown her nothing but cruelty. "You could simply banish them," she observed one evening, watching Kalen review documents related to Vanessa's future standing within the pack. "After everything they've done, no one would question such a decision. Justice built on the same cruelty we're trying to eliminate accomplishes nothing," Kalen replied, setting aside his papers to look at her directly. "I want this pack to understand that fairness applies to everyone, even those who have wronged others. Vanessa will face consequences for her actions, but those consequences will be proportional and just, not simply vindictive." Lyra considered this, understanding the deeper wisdom behind his approach even as part of her, the part that remembered years of humiliation and neglect, wished for something more immediately satisfying. "You're a better person than I might be in your position," she admitted. "I don't think that's true," Kalen said gently. "I think you've simply had more practice than most at understanding what genuine strength looks like. You taught me that lesson yourself, remember?" kindness given without expectation of anything in return. As the formal tribunal approached, Kaelin called for a gathering of the entire pack, wanting transparency in how the community's future would be decided, rather than allowing decisions to be made in isolation from the very people most affected by them. Wolves gathered nervously within the central hall, uncertain what the king's judgment might ultimately hold for their community's leadership and future direction. Garrick Voss stood before the assembled crowd, stripped of the confidence and authority he had once wielded so carelessly, his expression a mixture of shame and desperate hope for leniency. Kaelin addressed him directly, his voice carrying the weight of careful judgment rather than simple anger. "Garrick Voss," Kaelin said, "you have been found guilty of diverting pack resources for personal profit, of neglecting the basic welfare of your lowest-ranked members, and of fostering an environment of cruelty that allowed injustice to flourish unchecked for years. Your position as alpha of this territory is permanently revoked." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, though none dared voice open objection to the king's judgment. Garrick's shoulders slumped, any remaining hope for leniency clearly extinguished by the finality in Kaelin's tone. "However," Kaelin continued, "rather than banishment or harsher punishment that some might argue you deserve, you will instead serve this pack in a capacity that requires genuine labor and humility, working alongside those you once neglected, contributing directly to the welfare of the community you failed to properly serve. Perhaps through such labor, you might finally understand the value of those you once dismissed as beneath your notice." The judgment, while stern, carried a measure of genuine opportunity for redemption that surprised many within the crowd, understanding gradually settling over the gathered wolves that their new king valued reform over simple retribution. Vanessa received a similar judgment, stripped of her privileged status and required to perform meaningful labor within the pack, until such time as her conduct demonstrated genuine change. As for leadership of the Blackthorn pack itself, Kaelin announced the appointment of a temporary council composed of wolves from various ranks, including several Omegas who had never before been given voice in matters of pack governance, ensuring that decisions moving forward would reflect the needs and concerns of the entire community, rather than solely those already favored by status. Lyra watched this transformation unfold with a sense of quiet astonishment, understanding that the pack she had known for her entire life, the pack that had caused her so much suffering, was being fundamentally reshaped into something more just and equitable before her very eyes. She caught sight of other Omegas within the crowd, individuals she had shared quiet, commiserating glances with over the years, their expressions now carrying a cautious, disbelieving hope that perhaps their circumstances truly were about to change for the better. After the formal proceedings concluded, Kaelin found Lyra standing near the edge of the hall, watching the crowd disperse with expressions ranging from relief to lingering uncertainty about what the future might hold under such dramatically altered leadership. "How does it feel?" he asked, settling beside her, "watching this pack transform into something different from what you've always known?" Lyra considered the question carefully before answering. "It feels like hope," she said finally, "something I've been afraid to feel for a very long time, because hope has so often led to disappointment in this place. But watching what you've done here, the fairness even toward those who wronged me most directly, it makes me believe that real change is possible." "It is possible," Kaelin said firmly. "And this is only the beginning, Lyra. Once matters here are fully settled, we will return to my own territory, where you will be formally introduced as my Luna, my equal in every sense that matters." The prospect of leaving the only home she had ever known, however difficult that home had often been, filled Lyra with a complicated mixture of anticipation and lingering uncertainty. "What if I don't know how to be a Luna?" she admitted. "I've spent my entire life being told I was worth nothing. I don't know if I'm prepared for the opposite extreme." Kaelin took her hand gently, his expression warm with reassurance. "You already know everything you need to know," he said. "You understand kindness, fairness, and genuine strength better than most rulers I have encountered in my lifetime. Rank and title are simply formalities, Lyra. The person who matters, the person capable of leading with genuine compassion, that person already exists within you. She has existed all along, even when this pack refused to see her value." Lyra felt tears gathering at his words, overwhelmed once again by the magnitude of change unfolding within her life, transformation she could never have imagined possible during those long, cold nights of hunger and neglect that had defined her existence for so many years. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me when no one else would." "Thank you," Kaelin replied, "for teaching me what it truly means to lead with a good heart. That lesson, Lyra, is one I will carry with me for the rest of my life, and one I intend to ensure guides every decision I make as king from this moment forward." As the pack continued its careful process of transformation and healing in the days that followed, Lyra found herself preparing not only for a formal role as Luna of the Northern Territories, but for a future entirely different from anything she had ever dared to imagine. A future built on the simple, profound truth that genuine kindness, given without expectation of reward, had ultimately reshaped not only her own destiny, but the destiny of an entire pack that had once cast her aside as worthless. Spring arrived early in the Northern Territories that year, or so the older wolves within Kaelin's grand pack claimed, though Lyra suspected the mild, golden warmth of those first months had less to do with actual season, and more to do with the sense of new beginning that seemed to settle over the entire kingdom, following her arrival as the king's chosen mate. The formal ceremony marking her position as Luna had taken place within a hall far grander than anything Lyra had previously imagined. Wolves from allied packs traveling great distances to witness the joining of their king to a woman whose remarkable story had already begun spreading through the territories, whispered with a mixture of awe and admiration. The Omega who had given away her last piece of bread to a starving stranger, only to discover that stranger was the most powerful ruler in the region, had captured the imagination of common wolves and nobility alike. Lyra had worn simple, elegant clothing for the ceremony, insisting on modest fabric rather than the elaborate silks initially proposed by the palace's advisors, wanting her transformation into Luna to feel authentic, rather than a complete erasure of who she had always been. Kaelin had supported this choice without hesitation, understanding intuitively that the woman he loved found her strength not in ostentatious displays of wealth, but in the quiet dignity she had carried through even the harshest circumstances of her previous life. In the months that followed her formal installation as Luna, Lyra dedicated herself to reforms she had long dreamed of, but never dared hope she might one day help implement. She established formal protections for Omegas across all territories under Kaelin's rule, ensuring that no wolf, regardless of rank, would ever again be denied basic sustenance or dignity, based solely on accident of birth. She created systems allowing lower-ranked wolves to voice grievances directly to pack leadership, understanding intimately how silence and invisibility had allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked within the Blackthorn pack for years. Kaelin supported every initiative she proposed, recognizing in her vision the same qualities that had first drawn him to her, that freezing night beneath the oak tree, a genuine understanding of what it meant to lead, not through fear or hierarchy, but through compassion, that recognized the inherent worth of every individual within their care. "You've transformed more in these territories than I managed to accomplish through years of careful political maneuvering," Kaelin told her one evening, as they walked together through gardens that had begun blooming with the arrival of spring, gardens Lyra had insisted include areas accessible to wolves of every rank, rather than reserved exclusively for nobility as tradition had previously dictated. "I simply understand what genuine suffering looks like," Lyra replied, "and I refuse to allow that suffering to continue unaddressed when I now have the power to change it." Word had reached them recently of the Blackthorn Pack's continued transformation under its new council leadership, reports indicating a community slowly healing from years of neglect and corruption, Omegas finally receiving fair treatment and voice within decisions that affected their daily lives. Garrick Voss, through his required labor within the pack, had reportedly begun demonstrating genuine remorse for his previous conduct, working alongside those he had once dismissed, with a humility that suggested real transformation rather than simple performance for leniency's sake. Vanessa's journey toward genuine change had proven slower and more difficult, though recent reports suggested even she had begun showing signs of growth, particularly after being assigned to work directly alongside several Omegas whose suffering she had previously caused or ignored, forced to confront the human cost of cruelty she had once wielded so carelessly. Lyra found a particular satisfaction in these reports, understanding that true justice involved not simple punishment, but genuine opportunity for transformation, a philosophy she and Kaelin had come to share completely as they built their life and their leadership together. On a warm evening as summer approached, Lyra stood on a balcony overlooking the territories she now called home, watching wolves move freely through streets and gathering places that no longer segregated based on rank, remembering with vivid clarity the cold, hungry nights of her previous existence, the humiliation and neglect that had once defined her entire understanding of her own worth. Kaylin joined her, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of gold and rose. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked quietly. "When you found me beneath that tree?" "Often," Lyra admitted. "I think about how close I came to walking past you, telling myself it wasn't safe to help a stranger, that I couldn't spare food I desperately needed myself. I think about how different both our lives would have turned out if I had made that choice instead." "I think about it too," Kaylin said. "I think about how you gave me everything you had, without knowing anything about who I was, without any expectation that your kindness would ever be repaid. That single act of selflessness changed the entire trajectory of my life, Lyra, and ultimately, the lives of countless wolves across these territories, who now live with dignity and fairness, because you taught me what genuine leadership requires." Lyra leaned into him, grateful beyond words for the remarkable turn her life had taken, though she understood clearly that the kindness she had shown that freezing night had never been calculated or strategic, simply an instinctive response to suffering she recognized because she had lived it herself for so many years. "I never expected anything in return," she said softly. "I want you to know that. I didn't give you that bread hoping for a crown or a kingdom. I gave it because you were suffering, and I couldn't bear to walk away knowing I had the power to ease that suffering, even in some small way." "I know," Kaylin said, turning her gently to face him, his eyes holding a depth of love and admiration that still occasionally overwhelmed her, even after months of building their life together. "That's precisely why your kindness meant everything, Lyra. It was genuine, freely given, without calculation or expectation. That kind of goodness is rare beyond measure, and I consider myself the most fortunate ruler in all the territories to have found it, and to have found you." As the sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the peaceful territories now flourishing under their shared leadership, Lyra allowed herself finally, completely, to embrace the transformation her life had undergone, from forgotten Omega surviving on scraps and neglect, to Luna of the Northern Territories, using every ounce of her hard-won wisdom and compassion to ensure that no other wolf would ever again suffer the way she once had. The kindness she had shown a starving stranger on a freezing winter night had rippled outward in ways she could never have imagined, reshaping not only her own destiny, but the destiny of an entire kingdom, proving beyond any doubt that even the smallest act of genuine compassion, given without expectation of reward, held the power to change everything. And as Kaylin drew her close beneath the fading light of that golden evening, Lyra understood with complete certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead in their shared future, they would face them together, bound not merely by fate, but by a foundation of genuine kindness and mutual respect that would carry them both, and the territories they now called home, toward a future far brighter than either of them could have imagined during that first fateful meeting beneath a bare, frozen oak tree.